All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. This is a really exciting level of turnout, perhaps even more than we might have expected, although I guess considering the central place Ukraine has been playing in the news, maybe we shouldn't have been quite so surprised. I'm Dr. Vicki Gilbert. I teach in the Department of Government and International Affairs, and I'm currently part-time bowling ball. Today, joining us, we have a really exciting panel that is here to give us a variety of different perspectives on what has been going on in Ukraine right now. So I'm going to start at the far end with Dr. Mike Peters, President Emeritus of St. John's College, as well as former Executive Vice President of the Council on Foreign Affairs. And then following him, we've got Dr. Bill DeMars of the Department of Government and International Affairs here at Wofford, Clayton Whisnant of the Department of History, and Dr. Phil Dorroll of the Department of Religion. So the way that today is going to run is we're going to start off with each of the members of our panel giving a presentation for about 10 minutes on their thoughts about what's going on. Each of them has a different focus, which they'll be bringing to the table. After we finished all of those presentations, we're then going to move into a question and answer session. If you're thinking about questions, think about who you would like to ask your questions to, because I'll ask you to sort of specify which direction you want your questions to go. And if you're not sure, I'll just pick someone for you. Okay. And with that, I think we are ready to get started. So first up, we're going to have Bill DeMars of the Department of Government and International Affairs.
Thank you, Vicki. I'm changing my focus from what I told my colleagues. I said I was going to focus on the debate over when this dispute started, from 1991 to 2014. Instead, I'm going to talk about several things that surprised me very much about recent events. Number one, that Russia chose to position, some reports say, 75% of its conventional military resources on the borders around Ukraine. And number two, that Russia and Putin felt free to do so. They don't have to defend any of their other enormously long borders and coastlines. Number three, that Putin invaded the whole country rather than taking smaller bites, as he has done before, and this has surprised everyone. I am surprised that the first wave of the Russian invasion bogged down, but I'm also surprised that so many people in the West think that this temporary setback means that Russia must ultimately lose, and this is going to be an easy victory for the West. I think that's naive and overconfident. The sixth thing I think is very surprising is I don't want to be too harsh, but the cheap solidarity of Americans with Ukraine, where we think we're not risking very much, so we can, and we're not actually at war. I mean, we're acting as if, we're allies fighting side by side, our troops and their troops, but there's no American troops at risk. We may, if my worst case scenario guesses come out, we may well eventually abandon Ukraine if Putin continues to escalate as he fails. Failing the invasion doesn't mean that he's going to give up and go home. It means he's more likely to escalate in some other way. 7, I'm surprised by the vigorous rallying of NATO allies, especially Germany, and everyone is surprised by that too. But I'm also surprised by the fact that so many people that think that this rallying, Germany increased its military spending by 50% on a couple of Sundays ago, all on one day, sending weapons. Germany is sending weapons to Ukraine. That is quite remarkable, but I'm surprised that so many think that this is a rote checklist approach to warfare. It's unimaginative. We're not fighting the same adversaries that we fought in the past. It won't necessarily work again. It won't necessarily assure our victory, or even the continued cohesion of the NATO alliance Next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, could be a long war. I'm surprised that the world, the Americans, we Americans can continue to assume that these supposedly devastating sanctions, economic sanctions, being orchestrated against Russia are an alternative to war. Sanctions that bite are an act of war. Sanctions that pretend to bite but don't are a way of pretending to act. They are a real alternative to war because they're actually inaction, dressed up as pretending, to take an act. But sanctions that really bite, and some reports say that Russia's economy is either contracted or on the way to contracting by 20%, by 1/5 already. Sanctions that bite are an act of war. In traditional international law, siege and blockade are acts of war. They are certainly experienced as acts of war by the targets. And they tend to, if they don't give up, they retaliate in some other way. Finally, I'm surprised and deeply worried that Western leaders have not realized that, in my judgment, Putin probably does mean most of what he's been saying since at least 2004. To paraphrase, if you want Ukraine in NATO, I will break Ukraine and I will break NATO. And that he's prepared to take enormous risks and subject Russia to enormous harm to get what he wants. I'm surprised that we're not taking that seriously. The Biden administration, in its Churchillian moment, is not willing to give anything to Ukraine, to Putin, not willing to negotiate. It's a completely hard line. I think that's only half my time. Then I can say a little bit about when did this start. According to the New York Times, it started in 2014 when Russia took Crimea, the diamond-shaped peninsula south of Ukraine that juts into the Black Sea, and annexed it to Russia. And it also in 2014, Russian troops, but not in Russian uniforms, they were called Little Green Men, came into eastern Ukraine and essentially occupied one or two regions. These are the same regions, one of which is Donetsk, that Putin has declared independent countries. But that's not necessarily, there's other times. Putin has been saying, not since 1991, he started saying this around 2004, that in 1991, the United States, President George H.W. Bush and his secretary, particularly his Secretary of State James Baker, promised Gorbachev of the Soviet Union that if the Soviet Union agreed to the unification of Germany in 1990, that means East Germany, communist East Germany, joining democratic capitalist NATO ally West Germany, that the U.S. might, it wasn't quite clear, agree to not expand NATO 1 inch eastward. And it's more ambiguous than that, but it was discussed. And how can I say that? Well, last November, a historian, Mary Surratt, published a book called Not 1 Inch, based upon a number of years of her research and thousands of formerly classified documents that she successfully got declassified by 6 governments. And she's got the transcripts of the conversations between Gorbachev, James Baker, Helmut Kohl of Germany, George H.W. Bush of the United States. So that may be one of the starting times. It certainly was in 1990, as things were changing so fast after the Berlin Wall had fallen in 1989. Okay, 2 minutes. Things were changing very fast. It was possible that the unification of Germany might come at the price of abolishing both NATO and the Warsaw Pact, or keeping them both, or replacing them both with some common European security alliance. But instead what happened was the Warsaw Pact dissolved. All of its members eventually joined NATO. NATO survived and has been expanding since 1999. And that expansion is open-ended. Any country that wants in might be able to qualify, including the 3 Baltic states that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, including perhaps Ukraine. If Ukraine, why not Georgia? If Georgia, why not Uzbekistan?
All right, so thanks everybody. So I'm just going to focus my discussion on Ukrainian politics. Part of my argument is going to be that a lot of what's happening between Russia and the Ukraine does focus on Ukrainian politics. And I'm going to, if I had a PowerPoint, my 3 bullet points would be we're going to talk about the Orange Revolution of 2004. 10 years later, we've got the Euromaidan protests, so 2014. And then we're going to talk very briefly about politics since the Euromaidan protests. So the story does take us back to the early period of the Ukrainian independence in 1990. Like the rest of the old Soviet Union, the Ukraine suffered a pretty dramatic recession in the decade. The country lost over half of its GDP. It went through massive inflation, crime and corruption spread. And as in Russia, where Yeltsin was busy establishing a political system with a very strong, and we can safely say authoritarian-leaning president, you have the same thing happening in the Ukraine. A constitution, but with a very strong president under Leonid Kuchma. Now, Kuchma did help to stabilize the economy at the end of the 1990s. He got inflation under control in terms of foreign policy, though he tried to balance the East with the West. He announced an interest in joining the EU in the very early 2000s, but also at the same time tried to strengthen economic and political ties with Russia. His final years, though, in office were haunted by crime and corruption, scandal, and in 2004 he was finally convinced to step down, and so we had the first truly contested election in 2004. The election of 2004 was between Kuchma's heir apparent, Viktor Yanukovych, and the leader of the political opposition, Viktor Yushchenko. Yanukovych was openly pro-Russian at this point, while Yushchenko identified himself as a voice of democracy in the country, and he openly wanted to orient the Ukraine more in the direction of NATO and the EU. Notoriously, Yushchenko was badly poisoned during the election. And most assumed that it was a Russian operative who tried to kill him. The election turned into a crisis, what today is called the Orange Revolution. After 2 rounds of voting, the pro-Russian Yanukovych was declared the winner, but independent international observers of the election declared that there had been widespread fraud. The result set off massive protests in the countries. Major cities with hundreds of thousands of demonstrators entering out into the streets and calling for a new election. We should mention that activists received a lot of support in training from NGOs and also political organizations based in Western Europe at the time. And the Russians claimed at the time and continue to claim that the CIA was involved. The demonstrations continued through January of 2005 when the Supreme Court of the Ukraine finally called for a new election to be held. This time, Yushchenko, who had survived the poisoning, by the way, Yushchenko was declared the winner. And afterwards, we have seen the Ukraine drifting more and more into the orbit of the West. But the pro-Russian Yanukovych didn't disappear from the scene, though. His party still had strong support among conservative Ukrainians and also among the Russian ethnic minority that we're going to hear so much about. And if you've been following the news, you've been hearing so much about the Russian ethnic minority. Yanukovych was elected prime minister in 2006, and then 2010, he fairly this time won the presidential election. But despite his pro-Russian stance, Ukraine's parliament was still generally controlled by a pro-EU party, or series of parties actually, who wanted a closer relationship between NATO and also the EU. In November of 2013, Yanukovych tried to veto agreements with the EU This sparked probably the most momentous recent event in Ukrainian history, and that's the Euromaidan protest. Just as before, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators, many, or perhaps as many as a million, in fact, flooded into the streets of Kyiv and other major cities. This time, though, there was a lot more violence. There were massive clashes with the police. Demonstrators ended up occupying government buildings for a time in January of 2014. And emboldened by the demonstrations, the Ukrainian parliament did end up impeaching Yanukovych in February. And the now ex-president, by the way, fled the country to Russia, where he currently resides, and he was tried in absentia in 2019 and found guilty of treason by a Ukrainian court. After the Euromaidan demonstrations, the parliament reformed the constitution to remove a lot of the power from the president. And that power, some of it went to parliament, some of it went to the prime minister. Just as important, though, they carried out a massive purge of a lot of the pro-Russians within the government. This is what's called lustration. So what's happened since then? Well, 2014, of course, was a massive shakeup in the political scene. And still today, I've done a lot of reading on Ukrainian politics in the past week, and what I've discovered is that Ukrainian politics is very amorphous, not set in stone at all, constantly sort of fluctuating. One constant, though, is that politics is still very much underneath the influence of several wealthy oligarchs who, through their control of newspapers and especially television channels, tend to shape public opinion. And this, of course, is like Russia, if you know anything about Russia. But one of the differences with Russia is whereas in Russia, all the oligarchs have rallied around Putin, in the Ukraine, they're very much divided amongst themselves. And so this is going to be the basis of the political parties. So before 2019, the president was a rich oligarch by the name of Petro Poroshenko. His nickname is the Chocolate King because he has a vast candy empire and a confectionery empire. But he also has expanded into media and controls some television. As the first president after Euromaidan, he was a president to be dealing with the first stage of the war with Russia. Besides depending on intervention from European allies to hold off Russia, his general strategy was to seek compromise, in particular with the ethnic Russian minority, including giving them certain language rights in the East and also a degree of local autonomy over the regions that they live. Now, the pro-Russians in the Ukraine have not disappeared, and after 2014, they rallied around a new leader, Viktor Medvedchuk, also a major oligarch with ownership of several TV stations. Not surprisingly, he described himself as a Eurosceptic, and he wants to reverse lustration, so reverse the purge of a lot of pro-Russians. And this would, of course, allow for a lot of Yanukovych's supporters to get back into political office. The current president, Vladimir Zelensky, though, is not an oligarch. And in fact, you might even call him an anti-oligarch in a way. Strangely, he's famous as a comedian. And he originally, he became best known anyway as being a star of a television program that was on Netflix, The Servant of the People. This was a show about an impoverished school teacher who ends up being elected as president after his internet rant about corruption in the country goes viral. And he ends up getting elected as president, and based on the celebrity status that Zelensky earned through this TV show, he then actually ran for president in 2019. But he didn't exactly have a political party. And the result was that a kind of party ended up forming around him sort of spontaneously. A bunch of supporters ended up sort of coalescing around him. And so this is the Servant of the People Party, named after his TV show. And it currently holds the majority in parliament. And this is actually rather unusual for a party to have both the presidency and at the same time to have the control of parliament. Zelensky would continue to make moves towards NATO and the EU, but sadly, shortly after he was elected, he had a whole bunch of bad news coming his way. Under Trump, as you probably know, the US government yanked its support for the Ukraine. Military aid was cut off, and our diplomats were even pulled out of the country. And for a time, I think you probably know that there was some doubts in a lot of people's minds whether NATO would even survive, right? If the US wasn't there to back it up. And then in 2020, COVID hit the country. The pro-Russian Medvedchuk and his media empire attacked Zelensky for his handling of the COVID crisis. Medvedchuk even personally flew to Russia and managed to successfully negotiate a deal to get the Russian vaccine when it became available. But, maybe not surprisingly, Zelensky rejected the deal, suspicious as he was that strings would probably come attached with the vaccine. Everything for Zelensky, though, quickly changed with the election of Biden. Biden came into office, and soon the U.S. was showing an interest in the Ukraine once again. What's more, one of Biden's major foreign policy planks was anti-corruption. So Zelensky took the opportunity to begin a crackdown against Medvedev. The government shut down his TV channels in February of 2021. In May, the government issued an arrest warrant for Medvedev, and since then, Medvedev has been under house arrest up until quite recently. I think it was sometime last week that he managed to escape from house arrest, but up until quite recently. And then on the top of it, the U.S. helped give a lot of support to this. And in fact, the U.S. detained several of Medvedev's allies who were abroad. And the result is that Russia, as you know, began with a military buildup and last week finally an invasion.
Okay. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. So I'm going to talk about the religious dimension of all of this as soon as I figure out where to put my face. All right. So I think a big question that we've been asking is, why was Putin so obsessed with going all the way for the country in the first place? Why go all the way to Kiev? I believe American and British intelligence had assessed that that was a strong possibility back in January, but there was a widespread disbelief it would happen. And there's also been a lot of questions as to why there's been such stiff Ukrainian resistance. I think what can at least explain part of this, especially in Putin's motivation, are deeply held religious ideological beliefs that are becoming more well-known in Western media, but not as much as they perhaps should be. So, and that is, we are talking about a kind of Christianity here, first of all, that's driving this. And that is, both of these countries, Ukraine and Russia, are majority Eastern Orthodox Christian. If you don't know what that is, that's, you could call it the third great Christian tradition in the world, Eastern Christianity, highly liturgical, very hierarchical, deeply connected to cultures in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. It is characterized by a church structure where there's no single head, as in the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, but they're also not disunited ecclesiologically as separate churches, as the Protestant communions are, for instance. But the Orthodox Church is composed of a series of local churches who all agree to recognize each other as being part of the same denomination, but not having control over each other, like a federation of sorts. Two of these great ones are in Russia and Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church with the Patriarch of Moscow, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which I'll talk about in a second. Ukraine is about 2/3% Orthodox Christian. Ethnic Russians within Russia, about 70 to 80% report being Russian Orthodox. Within Ukraine, there's also 10% Eastern Catholic minority, which is Catholics who practice the Byzantine liturgy alongside Orthodox Christians, alongside the Jewish and Muslim minority there as well. A huge part of what's going on is that the Russian Orthodox Church, for the past 10 years, has developed a specific ideology that Orthodox Christianity properly supports a monarchy, is anti-Western, anti-democratic, and has the holy mission to coerce Ukraine and Belarus into that kind of Christian politics as well. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, for the past 10 years, has developed the opposite political theology, that Western democracy is fully compatible with Orthodox Christianity, and that they're willing to resist the Russian Church's attempts to impose their openly Christian dictatorship upon them. The Russian ideology is sometimes called the Russian world. If you Google it, it's called Ruski Mir. If you were to Google it, Ruskiimir. The current Patriarch of Moscow helped build this ideology. It argues that Russia is entitled by divine right to one imperial Russian space with a capital in Moscow, including the territory of Belarus and Ukraine, dominated by an autocrat on the model of the Tsar, the old Russian Empire, with the official religion of Russian Orthodox Christianity dominant in that territory, able to subdue other religions at will. And all that's missing for them is the city of Kiev, because Kiev was where Russian Orthodoxy was born. In 988, the first Eastern Slavic leader was baptized into Orthodox Christianity at Kiev. So the fact that right next to the Russian Orthodox Church's territory is their sort of spiritual homeland, but right there is a place where Orthodox Christianity has developed a robust pro-democratic, pro-Western, anti-tyrannical theology. I mean, they can't stand it. It's ideologically intolerable for the Russian church. So for instance, when you hear statements by, say, the Ukrainian Orthodox Patriarch Epiphanes, who gave a statement on the National Day of Unity on February 16th, leading up to the invasion, he said, quote, he referred to Christians, Muslims, Jews, faithful of different churches, and those who do not belong to a certain religious community, but believe in good and truth, are all children of one Ukraine. And of course, Zelensky is Jewish. The president of Ukraine is Jewish and receives the complete undivided support of the Ukrainian Orthodox community. A Jewish president is not possible in the Russian model because it's avowedly Russian Orthodox Christian nationalist and avowedly anti-democratic. This past Sunday, the Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill, gave a sermon where he argued that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was divinely sanctioned because Ukraine and the West supports LGBT pride parades and fights for the rights of LGBT citizens and actually supports things like universal human rights. And that those ideas, according to the Moscow Patriarch, are so corrupt that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is their divine right to do that. So my point here is that ideology, this is part of the reason why Putin, who's sort of a born-again Russian Orthodox, he was secular during the Soviet period, but has recently become very religious and listens to Kirill very closely. And this ideology, the Russian world ideology, was developed by the church and then given to the state, not the other way around. And so what I want to emphasize here or leave you with is that a big drive of this is a conflict within a certain kind of Christianity itself that accounts for a lot of the passion, a lot of the severity of this, and is not likely to go away anytime soon. In addition, let me also emphasize, the broader Orthodox Christian world has been mobilized against the invasion and talking about this issue in a way that I've never seen before. I should say, I'm Eastern Orthodox myself, have been my whole life. My family is too. My dad's side were all immigrants from what's now Belarus, and they were Carpatho-Russians and Belarusians. I grew up in a Carpatho-Russian church. My dad grew up in a Russian Orthodox church. I go to the Greek one here in town. There have been debates within the global Orthodox community for 150 years over whether or not that church can be Western, whether or not it believes in democracy, whether or not it believes in liberal democracy and universal human rights. There have been strong opinions on both sides. This war, to some degree, is a cataclysmic, violent chapter in that debate. And a lot of what Putin is doing is staking out territory to defend that debate, his side of that debate, and he means very much what he says because he is supported by the patriarch who thinks that they're all on a mission from God, essentially. Equally so, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine think that their defense of democracy is also a divine mission. This past Sunday, for instance, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in the United States, and remember these are all independent churches. They don't answer to each other. They're all part of the same denomination, but they don't control each other. The Greek church here in town, part of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, which is independent from both Ukraine and Russia, different churches, different jurisdictions, same denomination, different jurisdictions. They have issued statements condemning Putin directly inside the liturgy, which does not happen very often. At the same time, for instance, Russian jurisdiction churches in the United States, like what's called the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, ROKOR, in the U.S., advised its faithful a few weeks ago to simply not watch the news, which is one option. So So my point here is that I want that dimension to people to keep looking into that. I want to give you one name to Google about this. A guy named Father Cyril Hovorun, Hovorun. Again, Cyril, Cyril, Hovorun, Hovorun. He's a famous priest and theologian from Ukraine who's doing the most comprehensive work in talking about this particular religious dimension to it. He's authoritative on it. Read and find whatever you can by him. And I appreciate your listening to me.
Thank you all very much. Pleasure to be here. And I guess my role in this is kind of where we go from here, now that it's been set up so well by the rest of the panel. And so mine is going to be a little bit more speculative. And as I mentioned to some folks before, I'm always reminded of the great philosopher Yogi Berra. Prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. But in spite of that, I'm going to make a couple of shots at speculating about what might come forward. So there really seems to me to be four basic possible scenarios for how this war progresses. The first, and at least from my point of view, the most hopeful, is that some combination of pain from below and pain on the part of the Soliviki, the power brokers around Putin, causes Putin to reconsider. It won't happen in the short run. It may not happen at all. But of course, that's probably the most hopeful outcome. The worst outcome is that it progresses. It goes beyond, spills beyond the borders of Ukraine. It spills into NATO territory and requires NATO to implement Article 5, which is attack on one is an attack on all, and then the war accelerates out of control. I think that's also pretty unlikely, but we can't rule it out, and we have to be concerned about it. In between that, there is the possibility that the Russians will succeed in taking Kiev. I think it's almost a certainty that they will, because we can't underestimate the brutality of the Russian army. They were not met as liberators as they came into the country, as some of them might have expected to be. And I think initially when we saw them make less progress than they anticipated, it was because they were surprised by the fact that they just couldn't roll in, the tanks couldn't roll in, and everybody would wave their Russian flags and put flowers in the rifles of the soldiers as they came in, but it didn't happen. So they will take Kiev, and then they will consolidate in the eastern part of Ukraine. Ukraine is, you have those maps in front of you. The Dnieper River divides Ukraine about into thirds. And the eastern third of Ukraine is the area where most of the Russian speakers in Ukraine reside. And so they take Kiev, and then they link up between their forces in the north with those that are coming in the south that came in from the Black Sea. And the effort to do that would be to cut off the bulk of the Ukrainian military, which at least heretofore has been on the border of those two republics, Donetsk and Luhansk. And it has been the most effective fighting force in the Ukrainian military, because they have essentially been at war since 2014. If the Russians are able to cut off those forces, it will be a major blow to the Ukrainian military. And maybe after they do that, they stop. They put in their puppet regime in Kiev. They declare whoever this person is as the rightful president of Ukraine, and they implore the rest of the Ukrainians to follow them. The other possibility is they don't stop there and they try to push west, which would be a great challenge for them logistically. And we've already seen evidence that the logistical frailty of the Russian army, and almost guarantees that they will be engaged in a protracted guerrilla war insurgency that will be devastating to the Ukrainians and devastating to the Russians themselves. So those are the kind of scenarios that I see out there. And we can talk more about that, and I look forward to it with your questions. But then, to get even further out on the limb, I'm going to talk about what we might want to do to try to prevail or help the Ukrainians prevail in this. And the first thing and the most important thing to say is, I think we've heard it from others on the panel, that this is a test of wills. It's a test of wills between Putin and his supporters and their pain that they're willing to tolerate in order to be successful. And it's a test of wills on the part of the West, the Europeans, NATO, the United States. And it's really going to be a question of who blinks first. I think Professor DeMars alluded to it. The Europeans, all of us, have rallied around the Ukrainians. But when gas gets to $5 a barrel, when pain starts to come, how much longer will people be able to persist? And so I think it's important to emphasize the need for that. So what can we do in the short term? Well, the first thing is continue to share intelligence as much as we can with the Ukrainians, to give them the supplies that they need, both lethal and non-lethal. The second thing is we need to put more forces on NATO's eastern flank. If we're serious about it, and if we really are concerned that the Russians may accelerate, right now we have 1,000 US soldiers in the Baltic states. 150,000 Russians are in Ukraine, and they can call on another 150,000 to back that up. So we've got to put more teeth into Eastern Europe to make it credible. We've got to continue to do targeted sanctions. And this morning, I think it may have happened already. President Biden was going to cut off the purchases of Russian oil. I mean, that's a little bit painful for us, but not so much. But if the Europeans were to do it, it would be a great sacrifice on the part of the Europeans, and obviously harmful to the Russians. And we've got to look at other opportunities to put pressure on those. It's a good thing I didn't need those notes. We have to put pressure on those around Putin to help him and encourage him to reconsider. The next thing I think we ought to consider is working with the Chinese and trying to help the Chinese understand how this is not in their interest. That they share a huge border with Russia. And an unpredictable Russia is going to make the life of the Chinese much, much more uncomfortable. The Russians have a lot less to lose in destroying the existing order. The Chinese stand to lose plenty. Their whole economy is interwoven with ours. Their view of themselves, all of that is at risk if they don't understand the implications of this more broadly with what the Russians are doing. So, a few ideas, most of which, of course, will probably turn out to be wrong, but I can always fall back on Yogi Berra. Thank you all.
Carolyn, can I borrow you, because I can't run the microphone to people very well right now? So here's what we're going to do. This is now our opportunity to ask questions. So I'm going to pass this microphone to our handy assistant, Carolyn, here. So what we'll have you do is just raise your hand. We'll basically call people in the order in which I see those hands. If you would like to target your question to a specific member of the panel, that would be great. So just as a reminder, we've got Mike Peters, Bill DeMars, Clayton Whisnant, and Phil Dorroll. And if you're not really sure, I'll just pick somebody for you. And just a reminder to the panelists, you're going to have 2 minutes to answer the questions that you receive. Okay, so who's first? Oh, we got one. Okay, yeah.
All right, so just for the panel members in general, do you think it's a mistake for the United States to kind of forcibly disconnect Russia from all the soft power it has over it through sanctions?
It's a risk, for sure. But I think it's probably, at least at this point, the right thing to do. Over time, we may be able to calibrate this stuff a little bit better and, open some areas and close others. But at the outset, in order to demonstrate how profoundly unhappy we are with what is going on, I think it was important to be as broad as we could be in order to initiate those sanctions.
What is the likelihood of regular Russians, because we've seen protesting already from regular Russians and people getting imprisoned and everything, what do you think the likelihood is that the Russian people will actually do something against Putin or Putin's allies? What can they do in the real scheme of things? Can they do anything? Can it go towards can they help to maybe overthrow or something like that? But what can the regular Russian people do?
I don't think the Russian people are going to overthrow Putin. I don't think they'll succeed. I don't think they'll gain the momentum. The sanctions are unpredictable in their effects on mobilizing the people. Will the people blame the United States or blame Putin? Putin controls the media, so he can shape how they interpret the sanctions. I can't give any more evidence than that. It's just a hunch. I mean, there have been democracy protests in the color revolutions that started with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, according to most accounts. It spread to Russia. There were demonstrations, saying that accurately that Putin stole the election, but they didn't gain the traction. Putin is betting that NATO, public opinion in one or more NATO countries will break before his people get rid of him. It's more likely that elites could do something about it. Oligarchs, top-level military officers, but they are watched very closely.
I'm just curious, you mentioned that you believe that China has an opportunity here to potentially watch out for Russia. I can't help but believe that they're not in bed together, so to speak, that this is phase one of authoritarian regimes versus democracies. And I feel like Xi Jinping is sitting in the background watching what's happening here, and then turning around and will develop a plan of action with Taiwan as a result of maybe the way things are handled by the West, not to mention maybe other regimes as well. But I tend to believe they're working together, and maybe I'm being skeptical or ignorant, I don't know. But I'd be interested in your perspectives on that.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, Probably she was aware, when he met with Putin, that something was going to happen. And right now, China has been supportive in a sort of odd way about what's going on. They haven't criticized it. They also haven't embraced it. In the Security Council, they abstained. They didn't vote with Russia in the Security Council vote. But what I'm suggesting is, this is the kind of thing that it's a long-term strategy, and it's the kind of thing that diplomats are paid to do, which is to point out to China the potential cost that they could bear if this thing continues to go on. If China would never want to put themselves in a position of having to face the kind of sanctions that the Russians are facing now. That would completely undermine their whole economic model, and their economic model is the foundation of their political model, in which gives them the ability to help control their people. So I'm not saying that it's going to pay off in the short run, but I'm saying it's the kind of things that we have to be thinking about as a way to counter what's going on in Russia without directly attacking the Russians themselves. It's an alternative path to try to succeed.
It was mentioned that Putin is perhaps waiting to see which one of the NATO members would break, I believe that's the word, first, and then that might carry through the rest. Who do you think that might be, which country, and also what role do you think Turkey might play in all of this?
Surprise, I do Turkish studies too. It's actually my course, believe it or not. So I don't know much. I'm a theology religion guy, but my following Turkish Twitter and like Turkish politics and whatever it doesn't seem to me that Erdogan is super stoked about this. I mean, he's already given the Ukrainians Bayraktar drones, which are incredibly effective military equipment that the Turks don't just hand out. A lot of countries want Bayraktars. They're very powerful. So and he did that before the invasion started. He'd had contracts going with that before. Turkish social media is extremely pro-Ukraine, has been from the beginning. I mean, extremely pro-Ukraine. So anyways, all I can say about Turkey is I don't think Erdogan, it's not like the Chinese where there seems to be a shared sense of interest to be a part of this. I think the Erdogan seems to be, the Turkish president Erdogan seems to be concerned to fulfill existing treaty obligations with respect to the Black Sea and whatnot, but he doesn't seem eager at all to get super close to what Russia's doing.
I guess the one country to watch is Germany. The Germans were late to the table, if you will, in terms of being willing to sanction the Russians. As Professor DeMars mentioned, they turned around, on a dime, their whole philosophy. And Chancellor Schulz has, when he was a young man, he was demonstrating against the imperialist NATO alliance. So his roots are not deep. And Germany, of course, is one of the most dependent on Russian gas, oil, and coal. And so, if there's one key country for all sorts of reasons that we need to keep on board, it's the Germans.
I think it was mentioned in the beginning that we're a little bit naive to think Putin won't do more. I think. So at the risk of getting more involved, do you think that the Biden administration should or could be doing more, or just staying sort of where we are, if that makes sense?
The Biden administration is doing a lot. they're not negotiating. The one thing they could do that's more, and maybe it's too early, they're not negotiating with Putin, with Russia, over the things that he says he wants. In fact, Putin is provoking things going in the opposite direction. What I see happening, what I worry about, is that both Russia and the United States and our allies are painting ourselves into two corners, out of which we may not find an alternative to war. I think Putin can do more. To turn your question around, on the other side, there's lots of things that Putin could do. His cyber attacks have been focused on Ukraine. They haven't really focused on NATO, Europe, or the United States. There's lots of things that Russian hackers have been probing that they haven't acted on over the last decade or two. Number two, there's speculation that Putin might use a tactical small nuclear weapon in some context, break the nuclear taboo. I view Putin as a norm trickster. He takes certain norms that seem to be universal but are unenforced, and then he breaks them in a way that turns them against themselves. I think he could attack the Suwalki corridor, the 40-mile-long border between Poland and Lithuania, the southernmost of the Baltic states, which is how the three Baltic states are supplied by land from the rest of NATO.
Thank you. So I had a question for Clayton. So you discussed earlier the Euromaidan protests, and the relationship between Ukraine and the EU, and that interest is sort of moving in an EU direction. And there was an announcement, I believe it was yesterday, that the EU is taking another sort of moving on. I mean, this sort of a formal next step for EU membership for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And so I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about sort of, first of all, is that a substantive thing to do in this moment, that the EU is saying that they're sort of interested in pursuing these next steps for membership for these countries, and what you think that might mean in terms of how Russia could potentially respond?
Yeah, I was surprised by that. I mean, insofar as it seems to be sort of speeding up the timetable, right? It's interesting. I guess I have two responses to that, right? There's a part of me that's, in terms of my imagination, I'm very much on board the whole Ukraine thing, right? I love the idea of democracy. I love the idea of Eastern Europeans being able to choose where they belong and who they associate with. But there's the flip side of it, which is that it's escalating at some level, right? And this is exactly, I had students ask me, I guess a couple weeks ago before this all started, but as the military buildup was taking place, what was going to happen next, right? And I said, well, I don't know what's going to happen next, but what I do know is that Putin's a risk taker, right? Sort of a slightly different way of saying what you said, and that scared me a little bit, right? That I knew that he was a risk taker, and I felt there was a lot pointing to the idea that he was going to take this risk at this point. And what I said to another group who asked me to speak about that is that from his perspective, time is running out, right? And that if he's going to get the Ukraine, it has to happen now, which is, and apparently he's decided that this is something he's not going to lose, right? And so the fact that the EU has sped up the timetable sort of emphasizes this sort of sense that the time is running out, and that might in fact actually make him more adamant to make it work now, as opposed because he doesn't have it later.
Okay, so my question is more speculative. So obviously we're kind of seeing the ramifications of like the sanctions going on in Russia. I don't want to say especially because it's more severe over there in European countries. But over here, gas prices are already going up. So my question is, like you said, this is going to be like long-term plans that we're instituting. So are they going to, do we as Americans have anything else that we should be prepared for outside of like, industry prices going up, or should we be prepared for something else more severe?
Well, gas prices going up for sure. And I think the thing that we have to be most concerned about, and I think I totally agree with Professor DeMars, that there is the potential that this could get a lot bigger and could spin out of control. And that, I don't want to be an alarmist. I don't think any of us want to be, but it is, we could be finding ourselves in an actual shooting war with Russia. And if that were to happen, then the economy would be rocked even further than it is just with this. We would be facing a world which none of us have seen in the past. As I said before, I think that probability is relatively low, but we can't discount it at all.
So over social media, there has been a lot of reports that Ukrainian soldiers are not allowing Black people to cross the border. My question is that, is there like any historical or religious reason as to why they're not allowing them to cross the border?
Yeah, I've seen those too, and I think that's definitely happening. I mean, there's clear evidence that whoever's taking care of border crossings are basically deciding that if you're not coded as white, you're not Ukrainian, so they're not taking them. Yeah, I mean, I again, being from Middle Eastern studies, I do recall how different the response was to the Syrian refugee crisis, where people were not. There was this alarm that somehow Syrian refugees fleeing war, which was also started by Putin, well, not started by Putin, but heavily supported by Putin after a year or so. That Syrian refugees, because they're Muslim and they're quote, not European, would somehow threaten Europe's identity. That concern is not here right now. So definitely there's an element of race going on here, and racism and discrimination, without question. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Yeah.
I'm the moderator, but I'm going to chime in on that. That's also somebody who comes from Middle East studies. I mean, you're absolutely right, and it's an interesting sort of flip. And one of the things I've seen recently in social media discourse has been particularly on the part of Poland, and how the Poles have responded, and they're like trying to express this solidarity. And well, we really understand what it's like to be invaded by a foreign oppressor, and it's like this welcoming attitude was not present like a few months ago, when refugees were trying to get through Belarus and into Poland and then on into the rest of Europe. And that's so to people who focus on the Middle East, I mean, it's just a very stark contrast. And, one of the stories that's really getting a lot of attention right now is particularly for foreign students who are studying in Ukraine, who are getting stuck at these borders. And just, it's still winter and you're stuck on a border and you can't get anywhere. But yeah, so this is playing a huge part right now in sort of how this refugee crisis is playing out. Yeah.
You used different adjectives for Putin. One of them, I would say, is audacious. The idea of attacking nuclear power stations that could create a contaminated Ukraine, even without the use of direct nuclear weapons. Using weapons against nuclear facilities could contaminate the breadbasket of Europe, which Ukraine is known as. They produce a lot of the food which feeds a lot of Central Europe. So would that be an occasion for Putin to continue these attacks on these power stations for the West to get involved sooner, even if militarily?
Well, I I guess just to say that I'm not sure that the attacks that happened on those power stations were orchestrated from the Kremlin, from Putin. My guess is that this was a decision by some low-level tank commander who, in the heat of battle, decided that to fire off a few rounds. So I don't think it represents a policy move on the part of Putin, because let's face it, if there's a nuclear contamination catastrophe in Ukraine, it's going to spread into Russia the way the winds blow. They blow from west to east, and so it would certainly not be in Putin's interest to encourage that kind of thing. If it were to happen, I'm not sure whether the West would get involved militarily in order to try to deal with it after the fact.
I'd like to add something. If I were to be Machiavelli to Prince Putin, I would advise him that he needs to do something that will provoke the West to attack Russian troops in Belarus or in Ukraine, which would create a precedent for Putin to attack across the border into Poland or Lithuania, for example. So give Russian arms to Belarus troops who attack the Suwalki corridor, and then they move back and Poland attacks them across the border. That's the kind of norm tricksterism that would give Putin the justification to start attacking NATO territory.
What advantage does attacking NATO territory have for Putin?
Putin intends to break NATO.
I know, but he doesn't have
He believes...
Doesn't Russia stand to lose a huge amount if NATO gets involved?
Russia is already... the Russian population is sick and shrinking, has been for 30 years. Putin has played a weak hand extremely aggressively with certain, face cards, to extend the poker analogy. But Russia is a declining power because of demography. That's one of the reasons that time is running out. In addition, Putin is 69 years old, same as my age. I think I have an insight into his psychology. He only has...
You want to take everybody down with you.
Exactly. If we're going down, and he imagines himself as Vladimir the Great, remembered in Russian history. And he's willing for his beloved Russian people to endure a lot of pain to bring the United States down and NATO down.
Let's get one more question.
As a Ukrainian American myself, I think the increase in gas prices are a small price to pay for the lives of Ukrainian civilians dying in the country. I've seen a lot of Americans lately complaining about the cost of war and it's just putting all the guilt on themselves rather than caring about the innocent civilians, not just Ukrainians, like another girl said, the students stuck in Ukraine. They're seeing their families getting bombed, and I don't want to put an emotional stance on this, but I realize that the Biden administration is not doing enough. The sanctions are not doing as much as they could. There could be much more. I'm not very good at public speaking, as you can tell, but not enough is being done to help Ukrainians, and I think we need to step up the game. I've been going to many demonstrations lately, and the power and determination of Ukrainian people is very strong, and they don't want their country to be overthrown by Russia again, because this has been going on for centuries. The Russian Empire has been trying to erase Ukrainian heritage for centuries, and as this has been evident in the USSR as well, and even in past years, Ukrainian language has been declining and eradicated. And even now, people on the East have been trying to become more Russian or Russify. And this is just a direct consequence of Putin and years ago. And this is very bad and shabby, so please forgive me. But please, I just want not just the US, but more countries to show more support for my country. Thank you.
All right, I think on that note, we are going to conclude. Thank you all so much for turning out. I also want to make sure that we do a big round of applause and thank you to Dr. Alvis, who really has put a lot of work into making sure that this happened this week. So thank you to Dr. Alvis. And thank you all for coming.